Black Widow was captured by native warrior, but he fell for her instead. The drought had turned Redstone Creek into a graveyard of dreams. Dust devils danced through empty streets, while the merciless Texas sun baked everything into submission. In the cramped town hall, angry voices rose like steam from a kettle about to explode. Evelyn Marlowe stood at the back of the room, her dark hands folded calmly despite the hostile stares. The townspeople called her the Black Widow. They whispered that misfortune followed her like a shadow, that her husband's death in the mining accident 6 months ago was proof of her cursed nature. Magnus Thornfield's booming voice silenced the crowd. The cattle baron's expensive boots clicked against the wooden floor as he pointed directly at Eve. His words dripped with false concern about natural order and community harmony. The message was clear without being spoken outright. She didn't belong. Sheriff Jonah Larkin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His weathered face showed the strain of a man caught between duty and conscience. He'd seen too much injustice lately, felt the weight of his badge growing heavier each day. The mining accident that killed Eve's husband had been no accident at all, though proving it was another matter entirely. Eve lifted her chin with quiet dignity. She would not abandon the small homestead her husband had left her. Hidden beneath loose floorboards lay his geological surveys and water charts, information that could save them all if they'd only listen. The meeting ended with hostile murmurs and threatening glances. Eve walked home alone through streets that felt like a gauntlet. She knew her time in Redstone Creek was running short, but surrender had never been in her nature. 20 miles north, the Eagle River tribe faced their own desperate crisis. Talon Redcloud knelt beside the poisoned stream that had once run crystal clear. Dead fish floated belly up while children grew sicker each day. The young warrior's jaw tightened with determination and barely contained fury. Elder Soaring Hawk placed a weathered hand on Talon's shoulder. The old man's eyes held wisdom earned through decades of conflict and survival. He spoke of patience and careful action, but the younger warriors demanded immediate response. Their people were dying. Talon had earned respect as both fierce fighter and skilled negotiator. At 16, he'd prevented a massacre between warring tribes through words rather than weapons. Now his people needed those same skills to survive. The tribal council's decision was unanimous. They would take hostages to force negotiations with the town. Talon would lead the mission, though his heart carried doubts about the wisdom of such action. Eve spent that evening studying her husband's notes by candlelight. Tomorrow she would venture into the wasteland beyond town limits, searching for the underground springs he'd marked on his maps. She had no way of knowing that destiny waited in the form of a conflicted warrior who sought the same salvation she carried in her hands. Dawn painted the desert in shades of amber and gold as Eve ventured beyond the town limits. Her husband's geological charts crinkled softly in the morning breeze. She moved with purpose across the cracked earth, following markers only she understood. The land told stories to those who knew how to listen. Subtle changes in soil color, the way certain plants clustered together, the barely perceptible dips and rises that spoke of water flowing far below. Eve had learned these lessons at her husband's side during their brief but precious time together. She knelt beside a formation of red rocks, comparing the terrain to the hand-drawn maps. Hope flickered in her chest. The underground spring should be close, perhaps 50 yards to the east. Water enough to save both town and tribe, if either side would accept help from someone they considered cursed. The arrow struck the ground inches from her hand. Talon Redcloud emerged from behind the boulder cluster with 4 other warriors. Their faces were painted for war, but their eyes held desperation rather than bloodlust. Eve remained perfectly still, her mind already calculating possibilities and outcomes. The young warrior leader studied her with sharp intelligence. Something about her composure intrigued him. Most captives either begged or screamed. This woman simply waited, as if she'd been expecting this moment. The journey to the tribal camp took 3 hours across scorching terrain. Eve memorized every landmark, every turn, filing the information away for future use. Her captors spoke little, but she sensed their reluctance in the task. These were not raiders seeking violence. These were desperate people grasping for solutions. The Eagle River camp sprawled across a hidden valley, but even here the drought's impact was visible. Withered crops, listless livestock, and children with hollow cheeks told the same story plaguing Redstone Creek. Eve's strategic mind began working immediately. Hostile stares followed her through the camp. She was an outsider, an enemy, a bargaining chip in their survival game. But Eve noticed other things too. The careful rationing of water, the way mothers shielded sick children from view, the quiet dignity maintained despite their suffering. Talon secured her in a sturdy tent but left her unbound. Their eyes met briefly, and Eve saw conflict there. This warrior carried burdens beyond his years, responsibilities that weighed on his broad shoulders like physical chains. Elder Soaring Hawk appeared at sunset, his presence commanding instant respect throughout the camp. The old man's weathered face held the wisdom of countless seasons. He studied Eve with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. She spoke carefully, respectfully, acknowledging his authority while offering something unexpected. Her knowledge of water conservation, learned from years of frontier survival, simple techniques that could stretch their dwindling supplies. The elder listened without judgment. When she finished, he nodded once and departed in contemplative silence. Night brought different challenges. The tribal council's voices carried on the desert wind, debating her fate and their next moves. Some called for using her as leverage against the town. Others pushed for more aggressive action. Talon returned with food and fresh water. His movements were graceful despite his size, speaking of years spent tracking game across difficult terrain. When he sat across from her, Eve sensed an opportunity for genuine conversation. She asked about his people's suffering, not as an enemy seeking intelligence but as someone who understood loss. Her questions were thoughtful, respectful, designed to build connection rather than extract information. Gradually, Talon's guard lowered. He spoke of the poisoned streams, the dying livestock, the children growing weaker each day. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much suffering in too short a time. Eve shared her own losses carefully. The husband taken too soon, the mining accident that everyone knew was no accident, the town's treatment of her since that terrible day. Two people from different worlds, united by grief and determination. Talon's story emerged piece by piece. At 16, he'd prevented a massacre between the Eagle River tribe and their northern neighbors. A dispute over hunting grounds had escalated to the brink of war. Young warriors on both sides thirsted for blood and glory. But Talon had seen beyond the anger to the real problem. Drought had driven game away from traditional hunting areas. Both tribes were starving, fighting over scraps when cooperation could lead to abundance. He'd walked alone into the enemy camp, carrying only a white feather of truce. For 3 days he'd negotiated, mapping out shared hunting territories and seasonal agreements. His diplomatic skills had saved dozens of lives and earned him respect far beyond his years. Now those same skills were needed again. His people faced extinction, not from enemy arrows but from poisoned water and failed crops. The tribal council had chosen force because patience seemed like slow suicide. Eve listened to every word, her mind racing with possibilities. This young warrior wasn't her enemy. He was someone who understood that true strength came from building bridges rather than burning them. She made her decision in that moment. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford, but it was also the only currency that might save both their people. Back in Redstone Creek, Sheriff Larkin paced his office like a caged animal. Eve's disappearance had set the town ablaze with fear and anger. Magnus Thornfield was already organizing an armed response, calling for swift and decisive action against the tribal threat. But something felt wrong to the sheriff's experienced instincts. The timing was too convenient, the solution too simple. Thornfield seemed almost eager for this conflict, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of excuse. The pieces of a larger puzzle began forming in Larkin's mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly out of reach. The second day brought new tensions to the Eagle River camp. Talon found himself drawn to the prisoner's tent more frequently than duty required. Eve's quiet strength challenged everything he'd expected from their enemy. She had asked to see their sick elder, the one suffering from fever and weakness. Against his better judgment, Talon allowed it. Eve knelt beside the old woman with gentle hands, examining symptoms with practiced eyes. Her diagnosis was swift and confident. Water poisoning, but not from natural sources. The metallic taste, the specific pattern of illness, the way it affected the elderly and children first. Someone was deliberately contaminating their streams. The revelation hit Talon like a physical blow. His people weren't dying from drought alone. They were being murdered slowly, systematically, by an unseen hand. Eve mixed herbs from her small pouch, creating a remedy that eased the elder's suffering within hours. Word spread through the camp quickly. The Black Widow possessed healing knowledge, not curses. Children began gathering outside her tent despite their parents' warnings. Eve taught them simple games that also served as lessons in water conservation and plant identification. Her natural way with the young ones softened even the hardest hearts, but time was running short. Dust clouds on the horizon announced approaching riders. Magnus Thornfield's armed posse thundered across the desert, their weapons gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Talon counted 20 men, all heavily armed and eager for conflict. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was an execution squad disguised as justice. Sheriff Larkin rode separately, his face grim with reluctant duty. Behind his badge, a war raged between conscience and obligation. He discovered disturbing evidence in Thornfield's business dealings, patterns that suggested something far more sinister than simple land grabbing. The tribal warriors took defensive positions throughout the camp. Women and children retreated to the safest areas while men prepared for battle. The air crackled with tension and barely contained violence. Eve watched the preparations with growing alarm. This confrontation would end in bloodshed unless someone changed the game entirely. Her strategic mind began working, calculating risks and possibilities. She turned to Talon with steady eyes. The moment had come for complete honesty, for trust that could either save them all or seal their doom. Her confession stunned him into silence. She had allowed herself to be captured deliberately. For weeks, she'd been observing his band from a distance, studying their movements and methods. What she'd seen contradicted everything the town believed about savage raiders. These were disciplined scouts, careful to avoid unnecessary harm, seeking solutions rather than conquest. When they'd finally taken her, she'd recognized opportunity disguised as crisis. Talon's initial anger gave way to grudging admiration. This woman had played a deeper game than anyone realized, positioning herself as the key piece in a puzzle none of them fully understood. Eve spread her husband's geological charts between them, revealing the true scope of her knowledge. Underground water sources that could supply both communities indefinitely. Mineral deposits that explained why someone might want to eliminate competing claims. The pattern became clear as she traced the poisoned streams on the map. Someone with intimate knowledge of the local geology was targeting specific water sources. Someone who understood exactly how to create maximum suffering while appearing blameless. Magnus Thornfield's business interest suddenly took on sinister new meaning. His recent land purchases, his insistence on armed conflict, his eagerness to eliminate both Eve and the tribal threat, all pieces of a larger scheme to control the region's most valuable resource. Talon's tracking skills filled in the remaining gaps. Strange tracks near the poisoned streams, always leading back toward town. Chemical residues that didn't occur naturally. Evidence of deliberate sabotage hidden in plain sight. They had perhaps an hour before the confrontation began. Time enough to gather proof, but only if they worked together with perfect coordination. Eve's plan was audacious in its simplicity. use the approaching crisis to expose the real enemy while preventing the massacre Thornfield desperately wanted. Turn his own scheme against him through careful manipulation of timing and information. She outlined her strategy quickly, each element building on the others like a carefully constructed house of cards. Talon's role was crucial. His credibility with both the tribal council and his own warriors would make or break the entire gambit. But first, she needed his complete trust, not just as an ally of convenience, but as someone willing to stake his people's survival on her judgment and abilities. Talon studied her face for long moments, reading the intelligence and determination burning there. This was the woman who'd prevented a riot through pure strategic thinking, the one who'd turned capture into opportunity without firing a shot. His decision came not from desperation, but from recognition. Eve Marlowe possessed exactly the skills his people needed to survive the coming storm. They moved through the camp together, gathering allies and evidence with swift efficiency. Elder Soaring Hawk listened to their theory with growing alarm, his weathered features hardening as the implications became clear. The old man's revelation added the final piece to their puzzle. He'd been secretly communicating with Sheriff Larkin for months, both men recognizing that survival required cooperation rather than conflict. They'd been waiting for the right catalyst to bring their peoples together. Eve and Talon had become that catalyst, though neither had planned for such a role. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Dust clouds marked the convergence of three forces, each believing they understood the stakes. Only two people in the entire drama knew the complete truth. Eve checked her husband's charts one final time, memorizing the locations that would prove their case. Everything depended on the next few hours. The three forces converged in the valley like storm fronts colliding. Thornfield's armed posse spread across the southern ridge, weapons ready and eager for blood. Sheriff Larkin approached from the east with his small deputy force, torn between duty and growing suspicions. The Eagle River warriors held defensive positions throughout their camp, protecting families while preparing for war. Eve stood beside Talon at the camp's center, her husband's charts rolled carefully in her hands. Everything they'd planned depended on precise timing and unwavering courage from both sides. Thornfield's voice boomed across the valley, demanding the immediate release of his captured townswoman. His words painted the tribe as savage kidnappers who threatened civilized society. The performance was masterful, designed to justify whatever violence followed. But Eve stepped forward before anyone could respond. Her clear voice carried across the tension-filled space, cutting through Thornfield's rhetoric with surgical precision. She spoke not as a victim, but as someone who discovered terrible truths. The poison streams weren't natural disasters or tribal sabotage. They were deliberate acts of murder designed to pit communities against each other, while someone else seized control of their shared resources. Thornfield's face flushed with sudden anger. He demanded proof of such wild accusations, his bluster revealing cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Talon produced the evidence they'd gathered. Chemical residues from contaminated water sources, tracks leading consistently back toward town rather than coming from tribal lands, patterns that revealed intimate knowledge of local geology and water systems. Sheriff Larkin's weathered features hardened as the implications became clear. His own investigation had uncovered similar inconsistencies in Thornfield's business dealings. Land purchases that made no sense unless someone knew about hidden water sources. Contracts that positioned him to benefit enormously from any tribal conflict. The moment of truth arrived as Elder Soaring Hawk stepped forward with his own revelation. His secret communications with Sheriff Larkin had lasted months, both men working quietly to prevent exactly this kind of confrontation. They'd been waiting for the right opportunity to forge peace rather than escalate violence. Thornfield's careful plans began unraveling as more evidence emerged. Eve's geological charts showed the location of every poison stream, cross-referenced with land Thornfield had either purchased or intended to acquire. The pattern was damning in its clarity. The cattle barons' armed men shifted uncomfortably as doubt crept into their ranks. They'd signed on for a rescue mission, not mass murder disguised as justice. Several began lowering their weapons as the truth spread through their ranks. But Thornfield wasn't finished. Cornered animals were always most dangerous, and his desperation made him unpredictable. He called for his men to finish what they'd started, to eliminate the tribal threat before it could spread lies and confusion. Sheriff Larkin faced the defining moment of his career. His badge carried the weight of law, but his conscience demanded justice over mere order. The choice between following corrupt authority and protecting innocent lives would determine his legacy. His decision came swift and decisive. Larkin placed Thornfield under arrest for deliberate water contamination and conspiracy to incite violence. The evidence was overwhelming once viewed without prejudice or fear. Thornfield's remaining supporters melted away as the truth became undeniable. Even his most loyal men couldn't justify murder for profit when faced with clear proof of his crimes. The immediate crisis passed, but larger challenges remained. Two communities that had nearly destroyed each other now faced the delicate work of building trust from the ashes of suspicion and fear. Eve's role transformed from prisoner to mediator, as both sides recognized her crucial contribution to preventing catastrophe. Her strategic thinking had saved dozens of lives while exposing the real threat to their shared survival. Talon found himself appointed as official tribal negotiator, his diplomatic skills finally given proper recognition. The young warrior who'd once prevented massacre through words rather than weapons had done so again on an even larger scale. The process of healing began immediately. Joint patrols to locate and neutralize remaining contamination sources, shared medical knowledge to treat those already affected by poisoning, careful steps toward the cooperation both communities needed for long-term survival. Eve's homestead became the natural meeting ground for continued negotiations. Her property sat roughly equidistant between town and tribal lands, symbolic neutral territory where former enemies could work toward common goals. The geological surveys her husband had died protecting finally served their intended purpose. Underground springs that could supply both communities indefinitely, mineral rights that could be shared rather than fought over, resources enough for prosperity if managed wisely. Sheriff Larkin began the difficult work of rebuilding trust in local law enforcement. New protocols to protect all residents equally, regardless of race or tribal affiliation. Justice systems that served truth rather than power or prejudice. 3 weeks after the confrontation, the first joint council meeting convened in Eve's modest home. Representatives from both communities sat around her kitchen table, planning shared infrastructure projects and resource management agreements. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. Generations of suspicion couldn't disappear overnight, and many on both sides remained skeptical of cooperation. But progress was visible in small daily interactions, gradual changes that built momentum toward lasting peace. Eve and Talon's partnership deepened naturally through their shared work. Professional respect evolved into personal connection, then into something deeper and more meaningful. Their relationship became a living symbol of what was possible when people looked beyond surface differences to find common humanity. The drought that had threatened to destroy both communities became the catalyst for their salvation. Crisis had revealed character, separating those who sought power from those who served others. Truth had triumphed over deception through courage and strategic thinking rather than violence or revenge. 3 months after the confrontation, the landscape around Redstone Creek had transformed beyond recognition. New irrigation channels carved precise paths through formerly barren fields, carrying life-giving water from the underground springs Eve's charts had revealed. Green shoots of corn and wheat pushed through rich soil that had been dust just seasons before. The joint water management system operated with clockwork efficiency. Tribal engineers worked alongside town mechanics, their combined knowledge creating solutions neither group could have achieved alone. Ancient techniques for water conservation merged with modern drilling methods, producing abundance where scarcity had once ruled. Eve stood at the window of her expanded homestead, watching mixed crews construct the third shared cistern system. Her modest home had grown into an unofficial embassy, with rooms dedicated to meetings, planning sessions, and diplomatic negotiations. The woman once called Black Widow now served as the bridge builder, mediating disputes and fostering cooperation between former enemies. The town council had issued their formal apology on a sweltering Tuesday morning. Magnus Thornfield's arrest had exposed the corruption that ran deeper than anyone imagined. False reports, manufactured conflicts, and deliberate sabotage designed to pit communities against each other, while power and profit concentrated in fewer hands. Sheriff Larkin had established new protection protocols that treated all residents as equals under the law. His deputies now included both tribal members and townspeople, creating a truly representative force committed to justice rather than maintaining artificial hierarchies. Talon's appointment as official tribal negotiator had surprised no one who'd witnessed his skillful diplomacy during the crisis. His office operated from a converted barn on Eve's property, symbolically neutral ground where delicate discussions could proceed without the weight of historical grievances. Their professional partnership had evolved naturally into something deeper and more personal. Mutual respect had grown into genuine affection, then blossomed into love built on shared values and complementary strengths. Their relationship represented hope made tangible, proof that understanding could bridge any divide. The first successful harvest celebration had drawn crowds from both communities. Families that had viewed each other as mortal enemies just months before now shared food, stories, and cautious friendships. Children played together while their parents discussed irrigation schedules and crop rotation techniques. But challenges remained. Old prejudices died hard, and not everyone embraced the new cooperative spirit. Some townspeople still grumbled about sharing resources with outsiders. Certain tribal members questioned whether peace served their long-term interests better than traditional isolation. Eve addressed these concerns with patience and strategic thinking. She organized cultural exchange programs that allowed people to see past stereotypes and discover common ground. Shared work projects created bonds stronger than mere tolerance, forging genuine partnerships based on mutual benefit. The regional impact extended far beyond their small corner of Texas. Neighboring communities sent delegations to study their cooperation model, hoping to replicate their success in other drought-stricken areas. Word spread of the African American woman and Native American warrior, whose alliance had prevented war and created prosperity. Trade relationships flourished as the combined communities offered goods and services neither could produce alone. Tribal craftsmen found eager markets for their metalwork and textiles in town, while townspeople provided manufactured goods and technical expertise in exchange. Economic integration reinforced social bonds, making cooperation profitable as well as peaceful. Sheriff Larkin's transformation from reluctant lawkeeper to respected leader inspired confidence throughout the region. His fair enforcement of protective laws sent clear messages that justice would be blind to race, origin, or tribal affiliation. Crime rates dropped as communities policed themselves through shared responsibility and mutual accountability. Elder Soaring Hawk's vision of peaceful coexistence had manifested beyond his most optimistic dreams. The old man spent his evenings teaching history to mixed groups of children, ensuring that future generations understood both the mistakes of the past and the possibilities of the present. Eve's role continued expanding as her reputation for wisdom and fairness spread. Disputes that once would have escalated to violence now came to her homestead for mediation. Her ability to see through surface conflicts to underlying needs made her invaluable as communities learned to resolve differences through dialogue rather than force. The water crisis that had nearly destroyed both communities became the foundation of their shared strength. Joint monitoring systems ensured that contamination could never again threaten their survival. Backup sources provided security against future droughts, while conservation techniques stretched resources to support growing populations. Talon's diplomatic skills found new applications as territorial disputes arose with other tribes and settlements. His reputation as a fair negotiator who sought win-win solutions made him the natural choice for handling delicate boundary questions and resource allocation disagreements. Their personal relationship deepened through shared challenges and victories. Evening conversations on Eve's porch became opportunities to plan not just community projects but their own future together. Love had grown from mutual respect, nurtured by common purpose, and sustained by complementary strengths. The homestead itself evolved into a symbol of transformation. Where once a grieving widow had hidden geological charts, now bustling activity filled every room as the nerve center of inter-community cooperation. Guest quarters housed visiting delegations, meeting rooms facilitated ongoing negotiations, and the expanded kitchen fed countless planning sessions. Winter brought new tests as both communities prepared for their first shared seasonal challenges. Food stores had to be allocated fairly, heating fuel distributed equitably, and emergency plans coordinated to protect everyone during the harsh months ahead. Eve and Talon worked tirelessly to ensure that cooperation would survive its first major stress test. Their relationship provided stability and continuity, as others wavered in their commitment to the difficult work of building lasting peace. The foundation was solid, but the true test of their achievement would come when external pressures threatened to tear apart everything they'd built together. 6 months after the confrontation that nearly sparked a war, the first annual Harvest Festival transformed the valley into a celebration of unity and abundance. Colorful banners fluttered between tribal lodges and settler wagons, while the aroma of shared feasts filled the autumn air with promise and prosperity. Eve stood before the mixed gathering, no longer the dismissed Black Widow, but the respected bridge builder whose wisdom had saved two communities from destruction. Her voice carried clearly across the crowd as she addressed families that had once viewed each other as mortal enemies. The drought had officially ended 3 weeks earlier when the seasonal rains finally arrived. But the water that sustained them now came not from unpredictable weather, but from the carefully managed underground springs her husband's surveys had revealed. Engineering marvels born of cooperation stretched across the landscape, testament to what people could achieve when they worked together rather than against each other. Talon stood beside her, his presence both personal support and public symbol of their unprecedented alliance. The warrior who had captured her in desperation had become her partner in building something far greater than either community could have achieved alone. Their love story had become legend, inspiring hope throughout the territory that understanding could triumph over prejudice. Children played elaborate games that mixed tribal traditions with settler innovations, their laughter echoing across fields green with the first successful joint harvest. These young ones would grow up knowing cooperation as normal rather than revolutionary, their friendships crossing cultural lines that had once seemed insurmountable. Sheriff Larkin moved through the crowd with quiet pride, his badge now representing true justice rather than mere order. The equal protection laws he had implemented were working beyond his most optimistic expectations. Crime had virtually disappeared as communities took responsibility for policing themselves through shared accountability and mutual respect. Elder Soaring Hawk sat in the place of honor, his weathered face beaming with satisfaction as his life's work reached fruition. The old man's vision of peaceful coexistence had seemed impossible just months ago. Now it thrived as the foundation of regional prosperity and stability. Trade delegations from neighboring territories filled the festival grounds, eager to study and replicate the cooperation model that had transformed two dying communities into a thriving alliance. The economic benefits of unity were undeniable, with combined resources and skills creating wealth that benefited everyone involved. The festival's centerpiece was the dedication of the new community center, built on land donated equally by both groups and constructed through shared labor and resources. The building would house the permanent intercommunity council, ensuring that cooperation would continue long after the current generation of leaders had passed on. Eve's speech traced their journey from suspicion and fear to understanding and partnership. She spoke of her husband's dreams for the region, dreams that had finally come true through the courage of people willing to look beyond surface differences to find common humanity. The transformation hadn't been easy or instant. Generations of mistrust required patient work to overcome, and some individuals on both sides had never fully embraced the new cooperative spirit. But the undeniable benefits of unity had gradually won over even the most stubborn skeptics. Talon addressed the crowd next, his words carrying the authority of someone who had prevented massacre through wisdom rather than warfare. He spoke in both English and his tribal language, ensuring that everyone present could understand his message of gratitude and hope for the future. The festival's evening culminated with the official announcement of Eve and Talon's engagement, a union that would symbolize the permanent joining of their peoples. Their wedding would take place the following spring, incorporating traditions from both cultures in a celebration of diversity within unity. Magnus Thornfield's conviction had sent shockwaves throughout the territory, exposing similar corruption schemes in other regions and leading to widespread reforms in land ownership and water rights. His downfall served as a warning to others who might attempt to profit from manufactured conflict and artificial scarcity. The success story of Redstone Creek and the Eagle River tribe had reached territorial capitals and federal offices, inspiring policy changes that protected indigenous water rights while ensuring fair treatment for all frontier communities. Their local victory had become a model for national transformation. Winter preparations proceeded smoothly with coordinated resource sharing and joint emergency planning. The communities that had nearly destroyed each other over water now worked together to ensure everyone would survive and thrive through the challenging months ahead. Eve's homestead remained the heart of ongoing diplomatic efforts, with guest quarters constantly filled by visiting leaders seeking to understand how former enemies had become steadfast allies. Her reputation as a wise mediator and strategic thinker had spread far beyond the local region. The geological surveys that had cost her husband his life finally served their intended purpose on a scale he never could have imagined. Underground water sources now supported not just two communities, but an entire network of cooperative settlements stretching across the territory. As the festival wound down and families began their journeys home, the success of their experiment in cooperation was undeniable. Love had conquered hatred, wisdom had triumphed over fear, and strategic thinking had achieved what violence never could have accomplished. The stars shone down on a transformed landscape where prosperity had replaced scarcity, friendship had overcome suspicion, and hope had defeated despair. Eve and Talon stood together, their hands intertwined as they watched the last wagons disappear into the peaceful night. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.